Welcome to part 4 of adverse events, adverse event reporting to the IRB. My name is Liz Ness. I'm the director of the Office of Education and Compliance in the Center for Cancer Research at the National Cancer Institute. One of the most important considerations for an IRB once a study has been approved is whether there is any new information that would alter the risk for the participants. During this session, this part, I will cover what adverse events need to be reported to the IRB in an expedited manner, what a corrective and preventive action plan is, and introduce other new information that needs to be reported to the IRB. So an adverse event that meets the definition of an unanticipated problem needs to be reported to the IRB. The phrase unanticipated problems involving risk to subjects and others is found but not defined in HHS regulations at 45 CFR Part 46. OHARP considers unanticipated problems in general to include any incident, experience, or outcome that meets all of the following criteria. It's unexpected in terms of the nature, severity, or frequency, given the research procedures that have been described in the protocol and related documents, such as the consent and the characteristics of the study population being studied. As they need to also meet be related or possibly related to the participation in the research. So in the guidance document, it states possibly related, meaning that there's a reasonable possibility, again, we hear that term, reasonable possibility, that the incident, experience, or outcome may have been caused by the procedures involved in the research, and that the event or non-AE presents or places the subject or others at greater risk of harm than was previously known. And harm here can include physical, psychological, economic, or even social harm. So in this Venn diagram, which is in the OHARP guidance document, you can see the relationship between adverse events and unanticipated problems. The vast majority of adverse events occurring in human subjects in research are not unanticipated problems, as you can see in area A of the Venn diagram. A small portion of adverse events are unanticipated problems, as seen in area B. Then there are also unanticipated problems that are not adverse events at all that can be seen in area C. So the key question regarding a particular adverse event is whether it meets the 3 criteria of being unexpected, related, and putting subjects or others at greater risk of harm, as previously described in the slide before this one. I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of a non-AE that could also be a UP. These may be other incidences or experiences or outcomes that aren't related to an adverse event if they meet the 3 criteria. For example, an investigator conducting behavioral research collects individually identifiable sensitive information about illicit drug use by surveying college students. The data was collected and stored on a laptop that wasn't encrypted, and the laptop was stolen. This is an example of putting the subject at greater risk of harm, and harm here may not be physical harm. It could be psychological harm or even potentially social harm. There could be a dosing error. So a larger dose of the investigational product was given, but the participant didn't actually experience an adverse event. This example meets the 3 criteria, which, because it meets the criteria of suggesting it could have increased harm. Doesn't say in the definition of unanticipated problem that it did create harm. And also, a final example is some type of product contamination was found, and there weren't any adverse events that subjects experienced. So the FDA regulations also support prompt reporting of an unanticipated problem to the IRB. And you can see here listed the IND regulations, the IDE regulations, as well as the Part 56, which is the IRB regulations, under Title 21 of the FDA. You can also see what I consider a very helpful guidance for clinical investigators, sponsors, and IRB when assessing adverse events reporting to the IRB. That came out in 2009 and is still, current and applicable today. So the FDA believes that only adverse events that meet the definition of an unanticipated problem need to be reported to the IRB. This would include those events that were described in Part 3 as the IND safety reports or the safety reports. Of note, not all safety reports from sponsors, as I mentioned in Part 3, actually meet the definition of an unanticipated problem or a UP. So the PI does need to make that assessment. Also, as discussed in Part 3, unanticipated adverse device effects should be reported by the investigator to the sponsor and the sponsor to the FDA no later than 10 working days. So the HHS regulations require written procedures be in place. So this is under Title 45, Part 46, for ensuring prompt reporting of unanticipated problems to the IRB, appropriate institutional officials, any supporting department or agency head, as well as OHARP, the Office for Human Resource Protection. The purpose of the prompt reporting is to ensure that appropriate steps are being taken in a timely manner to protect other subjects from potentially avoidable harm. So the regulations don't define what prompt is. The appropriate time frame for satisfying that requirement of prompt reporting will vary depending upon the nature of the unanticipated problem, the nature of the research associated with the problem, the entity to which reports are to be submitted. For example, an unanticipated problem that results in a subject's death or was potentially life-threatening generally should be reported to the IRB within a shorter period of time than other unanticipated problems that are not life-threatening. Therefore, as you can see in this slide, OHARP recommends that the following guidelines are used to satisfy the requirement of prompt reporting. Unanticipated problems that are serious should be reported to the IRB within 1 week of the investigator, and I'll say / research team, becoming aware of the event, and other unanticipated problems should be reported within 2 weeks. However, please be aware of your own institution's Human Research Protection Program policy, as well as the IRB of records policies, because they may have shortened the time frame. They can't make it longer, but they can make it shorter. Typically, these reports are submitted through some type of a reportable new information form or database. OHARP recommends that investigators include the information that you see here on the slide when reporting an adverse event or another incident or experience or unanticipated problem to the IRB. Appropriately identify the information for the research protocol, such as the title, investigator's name, the IRB project, a detailed description of the adverse event, the incident, experience, or outcome, an explanation of the basis for that determination of the incident or outcome and how it represents an unanticipated problem, and a description of any changes to the protocol or other corrective actions that have been taken or are proposed in response to an unanticipated problem. And this is referred to as a corrective and preventive action or Kappa plan. So a Kappa plan establishes a process or sets up processes to identify, correct, and prevent future occurrences that may impact safety and data, and ensures that the quality of the research and the conduct of the study is maintained. Kappa's actually started in industry, specifically in manufacturing, as a process that is used in all steps of the manufacturing for a company so that they can identify, correct, and prevent quality issues from occurring. And this type of plan is similar to what's conducted in a hospital setting for a sentinel event, which many of you may already be familiar with. This is not at all uncommon for institutions that are JCAHO accredited or Joint Commission accredited. So just to briefly review Kappa terminology, a root cause analysis is a problem-solving method to identify the origin of the cause or causes of the problem or the issue. A corrective action plan simply is the action that's taken to eliminate the cause of the problem, and preventive action is to obviously then prevent the potential problem from occurring again. In crafting an effective plan, the investigator and research team needs to really think about why the event occurred. Is it a system problem? Is it a problem with a procedure, something within the protocol itself? Is it a training issue? The first step in creating the plan is to identify the problem. This can be a potential or an actual problem. You want to describe how this issue was uncovered or discovered. Next, you want to analyze the problem. You want to determine the root cause or causes and any contributing causes of the problem or issue by conducting that root cause analysis. You want to collect the evidence for the causes and document them. And remember, there may be several causes to one problem or issue. Once the root cause and contributing causes have been identified, you can then begin developing your plan to mitigate or prevent each identified cause or contributing cause. You may need to do some corrective action more immediately as you have identified the cause and you before you start to do a deep analysis then of a prevention plan. But be specific when you're listing each of the actions that need to be completed or implemented, and who will be responsible for those actions and the due date for each of those actions. You'll then need to obviously implement or complete the implementation of the corrective action plan and to then implement your preventive action plan. You'll need to look at resources. Resources do need to be allocated to implement each of those actions. Typically when what I call a major Kappa plan is truly needed, it's often not just the research team, the PI themselves. There are other, if not at least contributing causes that could be part of the preventive action plan in particular. And then once you've implemented your plan periodically, you want to evaluate the plan. You want to verify that the actions that were outlined have been completed. Were they effective? Did you need to do something else as a result of that? You want to confirm and document those actions when they are completed. And this may be a 6-month process of evaluation. It could be a year process. It may even be a little bit longer, depending upon what preventive actions make the most sense for the identified problem. But you do want to make sure that you ultimately document full closure of a corrective and preventive action plan. Even if something may not ever be able to be resolved, that might be an institutional issue, and you would need to at least note that. And it would, if your plan then you weren't able to close everything out, some view then that your Kappa plan would be considered ineffective and you would need to actually revise it. So doing an ongoing evaluation is extremely helpful to having a successful corrective and preventive action plan. Some types of correction and preventive actions you can see here. There can be related to the protocol in terms of potentially modifying your eligibility criteria that may be needed to mitigate a newly identified risk, implement additional procedures for participant safety. Monitoring could be related to modifying the informed consent as it relates to new information about newly recognized risks to previously enrolled subjects or informing enrolled subjects. May need to suspend enrollment of new subjects or put a hold at least temporarily until you have your corrective and preventive action plans well underway. And if that is part of your preventive action or immediate corrective action, you'd want to note what the criteria would be then to return to enrolling new subjects. Could be a suspension of the research project, increase in monitoring activities, providing some type of training, retraining. And again, as I mentioned, you want to work with your appropriate institutional officials to correct the problem. Typically, this is not something that just the PI or the research team will be able to fix. There are often other information that may need to be reported to the IRB that are not adverse events or not even unanticipated problems that don't overlap with an adverse event. These may be referred to by your IRB as reportable new information or an RNI. Examples can include noncompliance, which can be defined as failing to follow applicable laws, regulations, and institutional policies that govern human subjects protection research, or not following the requirements or determinations of the IRB. A major protocol deviation that has or may have a potential risk of impacting negatively on the rights and welfare of the participants or impact the scientific integrity or validity of a study. Any new information that might affect the participants' willingness to enroll or remain on the study, such as results from an interim analysis that indicate a new risk or decrease effectiveness of the study intervention, or maybe the intervention in one, if it's a randomized study in one arm of the study, that might result in that arm needing to be closed. It could be a withdrawal or restriction of marketing approval, even by the FDA. Can it also include a complaint of a subject that can't be resolved by a research team, death of a subject that is at least possibly related to the research? And this may have a more quickly reporting time frame to your IRB. So again, be aware of what your IRB's policy is on reporting of other reportable information. Any audit, inspections, or inquiries by federal agencies may need to be reported. Breach of confidentiality, a change to a protocol that was taken without prior IRB approval, that was done that didn't necessarily immediately impact the harm for a subject, an incarceration of a subject in a study that was not previously approved by the IRB to include prisoners, or even premature suspension or termination of research by the sponsor, the investigator, or the institution. So the IRB is responsible then for reviewing these unanticipated problems as well as other information that is submitted to them. They may ask for more information. They make a final determination of sort of what needs to happen. For example, you need to amend your protocol if you hadn't already identified that. more frequent monitoring or increase the frequency of the continuing review, or maybe even including terminating the study. And if the UP or the other type of serious or continuing noncompliance is determined by the IRB, then that does need to be reported to OHARP, and if applicable, for an FDA regulated study to the FDA as well. So in summary, UPs, by definition, are events that are unanticipated, related to the research, and pose a new risk. This applies to non-adverse events as well as issues of non-compliance, and the IRB must review these promptly to see if the risk-benefit ratio is favorable and what other actions may need to be taken. Then it is up to the IRB to review this, make a determination, and report accordingly. So for test your knowledge, the study coordinator identified an adverse event that they believe is unexpected, not related to the research, and not serious. The coordinator should report it to the IRB right away. Is that true or false? And the correct answer is false. The study coordinator identified it, but the PI and the sponsor did not necessarily. And finally, one last test your knowledge question. What is the process for developing a Kappa plan? Describe the problem, describe the desired situation, list the steps to move the problem to solution, assign a responsible party and due date assigned to each step, describe the problem, explain who is responsible for the problem and why, describe the problem, describe the desired situation, report back on the progress, and finally, D, describe the problem, describe the desired situation, list the steps to move the problem to solution, determine exactly who caused the problem. And the correct answer is A. You want to do all of those steps, not just subsets of those steps as identified in B, C, and D. Thank you very much for listening to part 4 of adverse events.